Hello, friends, and let's get started.
Lauren had always loved the quiet of the office in the morning. Those rare moments before the workday began, when she could pour herself a cup of coffee, sit down at her desk, and get her thoughts in order before she was inundated with tasks, calls, and endless discussions. Today she was earlier than usual. Her insomnia was keeping her awake, and Brian was away at a conference for 2 days, so there was no point in lingering at home. She set the mug on the table, turned on the monitor, and ran her fingers through her hair, thinking about the day ahead. For a second, her gaze slid to the desk across the hall. It was empty. Just yesterday, Tim had been sitting there, an elderly financier who'd been with the company for over a decade, but had suddenly decided to retire. The place wasn't supposed to be empty for long, and Lauren had heard that a new employee was coming out today. She wasn't particularly fond of change. Everything in her life was predictable, dependable. That was her security. She picked up her mouse, about to check her morning mail, when she felt a slight shift in the atmosphere around her. She didn't immediately realize what it was, but intuition always worked faster than consciousness. The door to the office opened. Lauren looked up, and for the first time she saw him. Tall, dangerously confident. He moved at a leisurely pace, but with a kind of predatory attention to the space around him. Dark hair styled carelessly, but in a way that looked intentional. The dark suit fit perfectly, but it didn't make him feel official. He looked as if the suit was not a work uniform, but an extension of himself. He stopped at the receptionist's desk and had a few words with the girl at the front desk, and Lauren noted how easy he was with words, how casually he smiled. He knew he was making an impression, and he was clearly taking advantage of it. Lauren shifted her gaze to the monitor. Something shuddered in her chest, but she instantly suppressed the sensation, pretending it didn't concern her. But it did concern her. She felt his gaze. Not harsh, not defiant, he just stared. Not looking away, not pretending to casually notice her. He was looking as if he'd already made some kind of decision. Lauren didn't like those looks. There was too much understanding in them, as if the man saw something more in you than just your looks. She couldn't stand it and looked at him again. Alex smiled faintly. Not brazenly, not smugly, but as if he'd already made up his mind. Lauren turned back to her monitor, pretending to focus on the letter. Inside, everything tensed up. He shouldn't be looking at her like that. He shouldn't have shown up here with this strange, elusive confidence, like he already belonged here. She tried to convince herself that it didn't matter, but the feeling that something had just changed lodged itself firmly in her mind. She heard his footsteps before he stopped at a nearby table. "Good morning." His voice sounded low but calm. She lifted her head. He was standing too close. "Good morning," she replied, keeping her expression neutral. "Alex," he introduced himself, extending his hand. She looked at his palm, then back at his face. There was no pressure in his eyes, but there was confidence in the way he held out his hand, as if he were absolutely sure she would respond. She held out hers, and his fingers closed around her palm. "Warm, sure, a little harder than necessary." "Lauren," she said, watching the shadow of satisfaction flicker in his eyes. He knew she'd noticed him, and this was the beginning of something she couldn't yet name. The office emptied out. Most of the employees had gone home. The muffled noise of the water cooler and the occasional click of keyboards were the only sounds in this nearly extinct space. Lauren sat at her desk, concentrating on making the last edits to the report. The evening light was shining through the blinds, creating a soft, warm twilight in the room. She thought she was alone. Someone else's presence was felt before she could turn her head. Light, confident footsteps sounded behind her, and a second later, she saw him in the reflection of the monitor. "Alex." He took his time, moving slowly, as if he was stretching the moment for himself. "It's late for work." His voice sounded relaxed, but there was a note of latent curiosity in it. Lauren exhaled, keeping her composure, and continued typing without turning around. "Someone has to do the work. I'm impressed with your dedication." Or, "Do you just not like coming home?" Her fingers froze on the keyboard. The question sounded innocent, but there was more to it than that. She looked up at his reflection in the monitor. He took his time sitting down at his desk, instead slowly approaching her desk, leaning lightly on the edge, crossing his arms over his chest. "What are you doing?" she asked in an even tone, leaning back in her chair. "Studying." He answered without a hint of humor. And what are you studying? You. He said it calmly, almost mundanely, but there was something in the air. She felt something instinctive tense inside, as if her body had realized the hidden danger before her mind. And what have you managed to find out? She crossed her arms, meeting his gaze with a slight challenge. Alex bowed his head slightly, as if he was really thinking, and slowly sat down on the edge of her desk. At too close a distance, in the zone of personal space, that you're not what you're trying to be. His voice became lower, a little softer, but even more penetrating. How's that? You follow the rules and live by them. He smiled slightly, studying her reaction. Lauren felt her breathing become a little deeper. She was used to male attention, the glances, the casual touches, the compliments. But with Alex, it was different. He didn't throw empty words. He didn't hint. He just let her make the move herself. She allowed herself a brief pause before answering. Maybe I just haven't found someone to break them for yet. Alex's eyes narrowed slightly, as if he hadn't expected that answer, but then he spread his lips again in a faint smile. Interesting answer, he said quietly, studying her with his gaze. Just an honest one. The room became too quiet. Only muffled sounds from the next room and their breathing. He didn't move, but his presence was felt with every cell in her body. Do you know it's dangerous? He said slowly. Lauren knew. She'd known it from the very first moment she'd met his gaze. But she didn't take her eyes away. A week later, Lauren stood looking at her reflection in the mirror. Her dress, a deep blue color she rarely chose, fit her figure tightly, accentuating her curves. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup checked to the last detail. Everything looked flawless, but something inside was wavering. I probably won't go, she said, raising her eyes to Brian, who was standing by the coat check. He turned around with a slight chuckle. Lauren, don't be ridiculous. All the management will be there. You can't just go, you have to go. I can plead a headache. You don't look sick. You look damn good. He stepped closer, running his fingers over her shoulder. The warmth of his hand was familiar, but at this moment, it didn't evoke emotion. Relax, it's just a party. He leaned in, leaving a brief kiss on her temple. Have fun, dance, have a glass of wine. Lauren nodded, but inside everything was resisting. She couldn't explain to herself why she didn't want to go, or didn't want to admit the truth. She already knew who she would meet there. The music in the hall was loud, the hum of voices mingling with the dimmed lights and the clinking of glasses. All the departments of the company were gathered in the huge banquet hall. Waiters scurried between the tables, serving appetizers and alcohol. The atmosphere was relaxed, casual. Lauren could hardly keep up a conversation with her colleagues, nodding, smiling, inserting neutral comments. Everything seemed ordinary, as it should be, but somewhere in the back of her mind a realization rippled. She didn't search for him with her eyes, but she knew he was here, and knew he could see her. She felt it before she looked in his direction. A second, and she found him in the crowd. Alex was standing at the bar, leisurely twirling a glass of whiskey in his fingers, listening to his conversation partner, but his gaze was fixed on her. He didn't smile. He made no sudden movements, but his presence was palpable, even from a distance. Lauren took a sip of wine, returning her attention to the conversation with her coworkers. She tried to focus on the words, but Alex's every move felt like the space between them was stretched by an invisible thread. He didn't approach, didn't come any closer, but he didn't let her go. This silent dialogue lasted all evening. They kept their distance, but with every furtive glance, she could feel the tension growing. Alex drank slowly. His movements remained relaxed, but there was something too calibrated, too deliberate in each one. She caught herself waiting for him to make a move, but he didn't. And then something inside stirred. She felt irritation, impatience, excitement. A second, and her fingers gripped the stem of the glass a little tighter. He's playing. She turned away, took another sip. Time passed. The music changed to something more rhythmic, and the guests began to fill the dance floor. Lauren decided it was time to leave. She left her empty glass on the nearest table, slipped her light coat over her shoulders, and headed for the exit. As she walked down the hallway leading to the lobby, she felt it again, an invisible presence. Leaving? She stopped abruptly. His voice sounded calm, but there was something in it that made her tense inside. She turned around. Alex was standing next to her, leaning against the wall. There was a slight shadow of a smile on his lips, but his eyes were dark, attentive. A moment of silence. She should have just nodded and walked away. But her legs wouldn't move. The air between them seemed to thicken, filled with hidden meanings. "It's late," she said flatly, but her voice came out quieter than she would have liked. "Yes." He pushed himself away from the wall, straightened up. "It's late." He didn't come any closer, but his gaze was everything. One step, and she knew he'd get her. Lauren froze, and then took that step herself. She just stepped into this night like in a dark water, not checking to see if she had a way back. Lauren barely remembered how she ended up in the hotel with Alex. All the events blended into one blurry, pulsing sensation. The alcohol, the music, the warmth of his hand on her wrist, the brief glances that promised more than words. She didn't think, or didn't want to think. The door to the hotel room slammed shut with a quiet click. A tense silence hung in the air, broken only by their breathing. Alex stood right in front of her, only a couple steps away. They didn't touch each other, but the heat between them seemed to spill over, filling the space around them. Lauren felt her heart thudding in her chest, echoing in her ears. She had to say something, should have stopped him, but she didn't. Alex stepped closer, slowly, carefully, as if giving her a chance to back away. But she didn't move. He reached up and barely touched her chin, forcing her to look at him. "Do you want to leave?" His voice sounded low, almost hoarse. She didn't answer right away, because the truth at that moment was scarier than a lie. No, and that was enough. Alex leaned toward her, taking his time, as if stretching the moment. Lauren froze, feeling his breath on her skin. The last second, when it was still possible to turn back. But when his lips touched hers, that chance was gone. The kiss was confident, not demanding, but one that made everything inside shiver. He took his time, exploring, tasting. Her fingers tightened on his shoulders, trying to hold on to something real because everything around them didn't matter anymore. Then things got faster. The tug, the flash of heat, his fingers in her hair, the smell of his skin. She didn't resist, didn't hesitate. She responded with the same hunger because this moment had been inevitable from the very first glimpse. They moved chaotically, unable to make out the road, stumbling, not pulling away from each other. Alex's jacket fell to the floor. Her coat slipped from her shoulders. She felt his palms tracing the curves of her body as if memorizing every line. He pressed her against the wall, and the thrust made her gasp, but not from pain, but from the realization of how much she wanted this. The night was flashes, scraps of movement, breathing, shuddering, touches that erased from memory everything that had come before. And then there was silence. Lauren lay on the cool sheets, barely breathing. The light from the window shone through the thick curtains, painting faded patterns on the ceiling. She didn't open her eyes right away. She knew what she would see, knew what it would mean, but she looked anyway. Alex was sleeping next to her, his breathing even relaxed. He was lying on his stomach, one arm draped over the pillow, the other a little closer to her, but not touching. He looked just as confident even in his sleep. Lauren sat up, pulling back the blanket, and slowly got out of bed. Stepped to the mirror, barely hearing her movements. The reflection was not her. The woman in the mirror was looking at her with a blank stare. Her hair was tangled, her lips were slightly swollen from kissing, and there was a scarlet mark on her collarbone. Not painful, but too bright to ignore. She ran her fingers slowly over the skin, as if she couldn't believe it was real. But there was no turning back. Lauren stood at the stove, stirring the sauce in a skillet. The smell of basil and garlic wafted through the air, and Brian sat at the kitchen island, reading something on his phone. An ordinary evening, an ordinary scene of their lives. She in cozy homemade leggings and a roomy sweater, he in a shirt rolled up to his elbows. Everything looked familiar, but inside Lauren could feel the underlying tension rippling under her skin. "How was your day?" he asked, not looking away from the screen. "The usual." She answered too quickly and immediately regretted it. Brian put the phone away and looked at her more closely, frowning. You've been a little brooding lately. Lauren felt something tighten in her chest. It's just a lot of work. We're starting a new project, you know? She turned back to the stove, pretending to focus entirely on the food. Calm, steady breathing, not giving anything away. I know, Brian stretched out, and she heard him slowly swirl his wine glass in his hands. It's just that you come home different. Lauren froze for a moment before quickly stifling a response. She grinned as if his words were nothing. You're exaggerating. Maybe. He didn't press, but it was enough to send a chill running down her spine. He felt something. The office was different. The corridors, the meeting rooms, the narrow, dark spaces between floors, they were more than just a workplace to her. Here time was split into two worlds. One in which she was a wife, and the other where she belonged only to that forbidden feeling that drew her deeper and deeper. Alex had never sought her out specifically. He didn't write messages, didn't make a move first. But every time they were near each other, his gaze spoke more than any words. Today, Lauren was leaving the archives when she felt movement behind her. A light touch, barely perceptible, but hot as a spark. You've been more careful. His voice was low, almost a whisper. Lauren didn't turn around right away. She closed the door to the archives, keeping her hands relaxed, even though her insides were tense. Should she be nonchalant? Should be herself. She felt his fingers slide lightly over her wrist before he removed his hand. No big deal, just an ordinary gesture. But her body gave out, a barely perceptible sigh, a second's hesitation. She turned around. Alex was standing too close. It's dangerous, she said quietly. Don't you like it? She didn't answer. He grinned, in no hurry to back away. She knew that look. He wasn't demanding, he wasn't coaxing. He was just waiting for her to make a choice. And she did. Lauren stepped closer, barely noticeable, but it was enough. Alex leaned in slightly, his breath touching her neck. Tonight after work, he said. It wasn't a question. She didn't nod, but he understood. That evening at home, Lauren stood in the bathroom, staring into the mirror, wiping the warm fog glass. In the reflection was a woman she didn't recognize. Suddenly, her husband walked into the bathroom. Where have you been? Brian's voice was steady, but there was something elusive in it. Late for work, Lauren swallowed, clenching the towel in her hand. Pause. I see. And that answer scared her more than if he'd started asking questions. A few days later, Lauren heard Brian's voice still from down the hall as he talked on the phone, standing at the living room window. The voice was normal, steady, but her body tensed, as if she already knew in advance that something was about to happen from which there would be no turning back. She set her bag on the table by the entrance and headed for the kitchen to pour herself some water, but he beat her to it. Dinner with my co-workers on Saturday, he said, not taking his eyes off the window. Her hand froze on the refrigerator door. Dinner? She tried to keep her voice as nonchalant as possible. Yeah, the usual. But you have to go this time. Everyone will be with their wives, and I don't want to be the one who shows up alone. Her heart skipped a beat. Sure, she replied, closing the fridge without ever reaching for the bottle. Great. I've already confirmed that we'll be there. She didn't say anything, just turned to the sink and turned on the water. But inside, everything clenched. She didn't want to know where it was going to be, who was coming, what kind of co-workers. She only needed one answer, and she was afraid to get it. But she knew, and he would be there. The restaurant was full, the dimmed lights, the laughter, the clinking of glasses all blending into a symphony of sounds, creating an atmosphere in which it was impossible to concentrate. Lauren stepped inside, holding Brian's hand, and immediately felt the muscles in her back tense. She knew in advance what she was going to see, but that moment when everything became real was even harder. He was there. Alex was sitting at the table among his colleagues, holding a glass of whiskey in his hand and lazily twirling it in his fingers, as if there was something more interesting behind that glass than all the people around. But as soon as she entered, he looked up and looked straight at her. That look, that faint curve of his lips, the elusive spark in his eyes, all of it pierced through her. Like a blade passing under her ribs, but without pain. Just a sharp realization. He said nothing. Didn't give himself away with a movement or a gesture. But he knew. Brian gripped her fingers tighter, pulling her toward the table, and she forced herself to smile. It was business as usual. Greetings, light conversation, exchanging jokes. She laughed in all the right places, said the right words, but every time her gaze happened to cross Alex's, something shook inside her. He drank his whiskey slowly, taking his time. He looked relaxed, even too relaxed, as if he was purposely showing that this evening was just another distraction for him. He barely looked at her, but that was an illusion. She could feel him, the way one feels fire too close to the skin. Time flowed agonizingly long. Her wine glass was almost empty by now. She caught herself thinking she was drinking faster than usual. And then Brian raised his glass. To honesty, a loud phrase, a seemingly innocent toast, but something in his voice made the air in the room seem to freeze. Lauren felt everything in her shatter. Silence. She slowly raised her eyes and met his gaze. Brian was looking directly at her. His expression was calm, but too meaningful, too intense. Alex tilted his head slightly, but didn't utter a word either. And then Brian said it. Yeah, I know. Lauren couldn't breathe. The noises dissolved. The voices of the guests sounded muffled, as if through a thick veil. There was only this table. Just this moment. Brian was sitting right in front of her, his back to the bar, and it was impossible to read any anger or rage on his face. Only weariness. You betrayed me, you slut. Muffled. Simple. Those words crashed in her chest in a way that made her throat dry. At first, she didn't even realize what she had to do. Her insides clenched, but her body refused to react. No one at the table moved. One of her coworkers cast a quick glance at Alex. He still held the whiskey glass in his hand, his fingers sliding lazily over the glass. But he didn't say anything. Didn't try to justify himself or her. He just stared. Brian inhaled slowly, ran his hand over his face, and then shook his head briefly, as if confirming to himself what he'd known for a long time. I don't want to hear it, and I don't want to see it. Lauren clutched the napkin in her lap, feeling panic rising in her chest. Brian, look, it's not like that. But he was already up. No fuss, no irritation. He stood up from the table, buttoned his jacket, and looked down at her. I'd long hoped I was wrong, he said calmly, but his voice sounded as if he were speaking not to the woman he'd lived with for so many years, but to a stranger. It made her shiver inside. She wanted to say something, to touch him, to grab his hand, to stop this moment that was shattering her world, but her body wouldn't listen. Brian. His eyes were empty. He turned and walked toward the exit. Just walked away. Without a scene. No yelling. Without a single chance to change anything. She stared after him, feeling something pulling her down, constricting her breath. It wasn't until the restaurant door closed behind him that Lauren realized she was sitting in complete silence and no one had said a word. Lauren didn't remember leaving the restaurant. Time lost its shape. People's voices merged into a droning, meaningless echo. Everything inside her was scorched, as if her chest had been torn from the inside out, leaving only ash. She stood on the sidewalk, breathing in the cold evening air, but it didn't help. The road in front of her was empty. Brian was gone. He was gone. Just up and gone. No yelling, no scene, no last chance to make things right. The restaurant door creaked open. Lauren. Her name sounded quiet but sharp, like a gunshot. She didn't turn around right away. Knew who it was. Knew he'd be following. Alex stepped closer, stopping beside her. There was no nervousness in his movements. His voice remained as steady as ever. Can we talk? Lauren blinked, as if only now she realized what was happening. Her head was buzzing. She turned her head slowly. He was looking at her intently. No pity, no excuses. Just watching, studying her reaction. Speak? Her own voice seemed foreign, dry, as if it came from someone other than her. Alex exhaled, ran his hand briefly over the back of her head, looked at her again. We knew this was going to happen. Those words fell on her like a stone. She felt something inside her shattered completely. We knew? Not him. Not her. We did. As if all this time he'd been ready for what had happened. As if all of this, her broken marriage, her betrayal, her pain was just an inevitable part of the game. Lauren took a step back. Jesus. Alex frowned but didn't move. Lauren, listen. No. She didn't want to listen. She couldn't listen. The world around her no longer existed. She couldn't see the restaurant. She couldn't hear the people walking by. All she saw was emptiness, standing amongst the shards of her life. And for the first time, she was truly afraid. Lauren didn't remember how she got home. She drove on autopilot, not noticing traffic lights, not hearing the honking of cars. Brian's voice still echoed in her ears. You betrayed me. And that look, cold, empty, final. The door to their house was closed, unlocked, but that didn't change anything. She pushed the knob, stepped into the darkness of the hallway, and froze. Silence. Brian was here. She could feel it just as she could feel his anger, his pain, his final decision. Her fingers clenched on the strap of her bag. Brian? No answer. She walked into the living room, and there he was, standing at the window, his back to her, his shoulders tense. Jacket off, shirt unbuttoned at the collar, hands clenched tightly into fists. He didn't turn around. Brian, please, let's talk. The seconds dragged agonizingly long until he turned around. His eyes. She'd never seen them like that before. Talk? His voice was quiet, but there was rage in it. You want to explain to me how you fucked that bastard? Lauren flinched, her breath hitching. It's not like that. It's not. He took a step toward her, and she recoiled. Did you think I was blind? Did you think your delays at work, your whispers, your fake smiles would go unnoticed? You what? He growled this, but then he exhaled, shook his head, and laughed. Harshly, without a drop of humor. I wanted to disbelieve, you know. I convinced myself it was my paranoia, that you were just tired, that you were having a hard time. Hell, I blame myself. He slammed his fist into the wall, and Lauren flinched. But you just decided I was a fool, didn't you? That I wouldn't notice the way you look at him, the way you run after him, the way he touches you right under my nose. I didn't mean. You didn't? His eyes sparkled. If you didn't want to, you wouldn't have gone under him. She closed her eyes, breathing hard. I made a mistake. A mistake? His voice was quiet, and that made it worse. A mistake is spilling coffee on the paperwork. And you broke the hell out of it. Lauren wanted to touch him, but he pulled away sharply, as if her touch disgusted him. Don't you dare. His voice sounded low, breaking into a growl. She felt her insides clench. Brian, please. I love you. You love me? He laughed again. Then why the hell were you spreading your legs for someone else? Lauren covered her mouth with her hand, her body shaking. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, too. He turned away, walked over to the desk, grabbed some papers, and tossed them on the couch in front of her. These are divorce papers. I already signed them. She caught her breath. No. Yes. He looked right into her eyes. You're no longer my wife. With those words, he turned and walked away into the bedroom, slamming the door behind him. And Lauren was alone, standing in the ruins of her life. And she knew there was no turning back. And that's where today's story ends. Thank you for watching to the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and comment. We'd love to discuss this story with you. See you in the next video.